cold wind bit at her exposed skin, a chilling echo of the words that had just stripped her bare. Infertile, they had said, a single damning word that had shattered her future, twisting her very essence into something disposable. This was not a plea nor a negotiation but a transaction, brutal in its simplicity, devastating in its finality. Her own parents, the ones who had brought her into this world, now cast her out, a failed vessel, a broken promise in their eyes. The weight of their gaze, colder than any winter's breath, pressed down on her, silencing the protests that clawed at her throat. A daughter, traded away for the barrenness they claimed was her curse, a price paid for an empty womb. The world, as she knew it, ceased to exist in that moment, replaced by a raw, guttural ache that settled deep in her bones. There was no warmth, no kindness, only the stark reality of her displacement, the chilling knowledge that her value was measured only by what she could produce, and in that, she had failed. The air thickened with unspoken accusations, each breath a struggle against the suffocating truth. Her parents stood as immovable as stone, their faces etched with a grim resolve that left no room for pity or reprieve. Their eyes, once familiar, now held the distant, assessing look of merchants appraising unwanted goods. It was a betrayal that transcended flesh and blood, reaching instead into the very core of her being, severing ties that she had once believed unbreakable. The silence that followed their decree was heavier than any shout, loaded with the crushing weight of their final judgment. It felt like an ending, not just of a chapter, but of her very story, leaving her adrift in a desolate sea of despair. This was the moment her world fractured, shattering into countless sharp, unforgiving pieces. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The wagon rattled along the rutted track, each jolt a fresh reminder of her diminished state, a physical manifestation of the emotional tremors that racked her soul. Ilara sat hunched, a small bundle of defiance against the vast, indifferent landscape that stretched out before her. The world outside the wagon's confines blurred into a monotonous sweep of desaturated earth and skeletal trees, mirroring the bleakness within her. Her mind replayed the scene, a grotesque theatrical performance of her parents' final dismissive gestures, the glint of coins exchanged for a life. Her life, the sting of tears, long since dried, still lingered in her eyes, a phantom burn. She was being delivered, like a parcel of goods, to a man she knew only by rumor, and the terse, mumbled contract whispered between her father and the stoic, unyielding face of the driver. A blacksmith. The word conjured images of fire, smoke, and hardened metal, a stark contrast to the delicate dreams she had once harbored. Dreams of a life built on softness, on the promise of new beginnings that would now forever remain out of reach. The silence of the journey was punctuated only by the creak of the wheels and the distant caw of crows, a mournful chorus that seemed to lament her fate. She clutched a small, worn wooden bird, a relic from a childhood that now felt impossibly distant, a fragile symbol of a hope that had withered under the relentless sun of disappointment. The sun, a harsh, indifferent orb, beat down upon the parched earth, casting long, stark shadows that seemed to swallow her whole. Every mile driven was another strand of her old life snapping, another severing of what little identity she had clung to. She was Ilara, but what did that mean now? A commodity, a burden, a barren field. The labels echoed a relentless, punishing rhythm in her mind, each beat driving her further into the abyss of self-doubt. The air was thick with dust, the taste of it gritty on her tongue, a constant reminder of the desolation that surrounded her, both outwardly and within. The forge loomed in the distance, a dark, squat silhouette against the bruised twilight sky, exhaling plumes of smoke that coiled into the heavens like mournful prayers. As the wagon creaked to a halt, the air grew thick with the metallic tang of heated iron and the faint, acrid scent of coal. It was a place of industry, raw and unyielding, far removed from the soft domestic spaces she had known. Silas, the blacksmith, emerged from the shadowed maw of his workshop, a figure hewn from the very essence of his craft. His frame was broad, unyielding, his movements economical, powerful. Streaks of soot marked his face, accentuating the deep lines around his eyes that held an ancient, weary wisdom, yet revealed little emotion. They were the eyes of a man who had seen much, endured more, and perhaps felt too deeply to show it easily. He didn't offer a greeting, nor a welcoming gesture, only a curt nod to the driver, and a piercing, almost unnerving gaze directed at Alara. Her parents' cold detachment now seemed a familiar comfort compared to this man's impenetrable silence. He was a wall of hardened steel, and she, a fragile, discarded vessel. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken transactions and the chilling weight of her new reality. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. There was no pity in his stare, no overt malice, just a stark assessment that made her feel acutely aware of her own smallness, her insignificance in the face of his imposing presence. He was the master of fire and metal, and she simply an addition to his solitary domain, another piece of property acquired, perhaps out of necessity, perhaps out of a strange, unfathomable whim. The heat radiating from the forge felt almost alive, a pulsing heart within the workshop, a stark contrast to the coldness that had defined her recent days. She knew, instinctively, that this place, this man, represented a profound shift, a descent into a life stripped bare of all pretenses, a life forged in the crucible of hard labor and unspoken truths. Life at the forge settled into a rhythm of arduous labor and profound silence, punctuated only by the clang of hammer on anvil, the roar of the bellows, and the hiss of cooling metal. Ilara's hands, once accustomed to the gentler tasks of a farmer's daughter, quickly became calloused, her muscles aching with unfamiliar strains. She hauled coal, stoked fires, and tirelessly worked the bellows, her every movement dictated by Silas's terse, clipped commands or the unspoken demands of the roaring inferno. The forge was Silas's domain, a world unto itself, and she was merely an auxiliary, a shadow moving within its fiery confines. He spoke little, his instructions precise, his approval or disapproval conveyed through a shift in his posture or the subtle tightening of his jaw. Days bled into weeks, each one a repetitive cycle of toil, punctuated by brief, unceremonious meals. There was no shared laughter, no casual conversation, only the hum of industry and the quiet, persistent thrum of her own thoughts. She watched him endlessly, seeking some clue to the man behind the stoic facade. His movements were fluid, powerful, a dance with fire and iron, a stark contrast to the rigid stillness he adopted when not at work. Often she would catch glimpses of a fleeting expression in his eyes, a flicker of something akin to sadness, or perhaps a deep-seated weariness that mirrored her own. It was in these stolen moments of observation that a fragile thread of curiosity began to unravel the knot of her despair. She remembered, a sharp, unwelcome flashback, her mother's voice brittle and hard, echoing the village whispers. A barren field. What use is a field that yields no harvest? The words, a poisoned dart, had sunk deep, festering in her soul, shaping her identity into one defined by absence. Here at the forge she was just Ilara, a worker, a presence. The label of infertile still clung to her, a suffocating shroud. But here, in the smoke and sweat, it felt less immediate, less defining. The forge itself seemed to pulse with a hidden power, a place where raw elements were transformed, brokenness made whole, or perhaps simply repurposed. It was a place where strength was forged, not just in metal, but in spirit, a crucible that might, she dared to hope, temper her own shattered resolve. One evening, as the last fiery glows faded from the iron, a shard of metal flung from the anvil struck Silas's hand with a sickening thud. He winced, a rare, almost imperceptible flicker of pain crossing his face, before quickly resuming his stoic mask. But Ilara had seen it, the vulnerability, the momentary breach in his impenetrable armor. Without a word, she retrieved a clean rag and a small pot of salve from a dusty shelf, a silent offering. He looked at her then, his eyes, for once, not assessing, but momentarily disarmed. A flicker, almost too brief to register, of surprise, perhaps even gratitude. He accepted the salve, applying it himself with practiced ease, But the gesture had softened the air between them, if only for a breath. Later, as she sorted through a pile of salvaged scraps, she found a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, identical to her own, tucked away beneath a stack of rusted hinges. Its wing was broken, expertly mended with a fine, almost invisible line of wire, a fragile beauty in the midst of decay. She looked at Silas, who sat hunched by the dying embers, his gaze fixed on nothing. Was this his handiwork? A hidden tenderness beneath the hardened exterior? The realization dawned on her, quiet and profound. He was not just a man of iron and fire, but a man who mended, who saw worth in what was broken, who perhaps understood the subtle art of repair. Her own reflection, shimmering distortedly in a discarded piece of polished steel, seemed to hold a new glimmer. She was still a barren field, perhaps, but even barren fields had their own stark beauty, their own untamed strength. The societal whispers of her infertility still echoed, a distant, mocking chorus. But here, in the quiet camaraderie of the forge, they began to lose their sharpest edges. The clanging symphony of the hammer now seemed to resonate with a different cadence, a rhythm of resilience, of crafting something new from the fragments of the old. The silence between them was no longer oppressive, but a shared space where unspoken empathy could take root, a fragile sprout in the desolate landscape of their lives. The fragile peace of the forge was shattered one brittle autumn morning by the arrival of the local land steward, Mr. Thorne, a man whose polished boots and condescending sneer were as sharp as his business acumen. He embodied the superficiality and cruel judgment of their isolated community, his presence a stark reminder of the world Ilara had been exiled from. He swept into the forge, his gaze dismissive, settling on Ilara with an air of distaste. "Still housing that unfortunate one, Silas?" he sneered, his voice dripping with thinly veiled contempt, referencing her infertility without needing to utter the word. "Wouldn't want to bring down the value of the property now, would we?" People talk. Silas, typically a man of few words, straightened, his hammer still in hand, his posture radiating a quiet, dangerous resolve. "She earns her keep, Thorne. More than some I could name." His voice was low, rumbling like distant thunder, the subtext of his words slicing through the steward's polished facade. Thorne's eyes narrowed, sensing the shift in Silas's demeanor. This was not the isolated, compliant blacksmith he was used to. A palpable tension filled the air, thick with the scent of hot iron and unspoken threats. Ilara felt a surge of unexpected protectiveness from Silas, a silent wall erected between her and the steward's cutting remarks. It was a revelation, a silent declaration that she was no longer merely property, but a person under his quiet, formidable protection. A quick flashback pierced her thoughts. Her father's face, haggard with worry, as he explained the dire financial straits that necessitated her sale, painting a picture of a community teetering on the brink of ruin. Thorne represented that old world, the one that had valued her only for her potential to bear children, and dismissed her when that potential was deemed absent. The confrontation, terse and charged, hung in the air, a testament to the fragile yet hardening bond between the blacksmith and the outcast. It was a test, and in that moment, Silas, in his quiet defiance, had chosen her. The aftermath of Thorne's visit left a subtle, yet profound shift in the atmosphere of the forge. The tension, though outwardly dissipated, had solidified something unspoken between Ilara and Silas. The blacksmith's silence remained, but it was no longer a barrier. It was a shared space, a testament to their mutual understanding. Ilara found herself observing Silas with a new depth, noticing the subtle tremor in his hand when he lifted a particularly heavy beam, the way his shoulders slumped just slightly after a long, grueling day. She began to see the weariness, the hidden burdens he carried beneath his hardened exterior. One evening, as the coals glowed like dying embers, Silas offered her a crude but strangely comforting mug of lukewarm tea. He sat opposite her, not meeting her gaze directly, but his presence was a reassuring anchor in the quiet. "My hands," he rasped, his voice rough with disuse. "They ache sometimes." It was a confession, not a complaint, a rare glimpse into his own vulnerabilities. Ilara simply nodded, her heart aching with a sudden, overwhelming empathy. She saw now that he too was a man shaped by hardship, perhaps broken in ways that mirrored her own. yet finding a strength in the reshaping. He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. His past was etched in the lines of his face, the scars on his hands, the deep-seated loneliness that had once resonated with her own. He was not just her rescuer, but a fellow survivor, a kindred spirit forged in the same crucible of adversity. The forge, once a symbol of her desolate future, now seemed to pulse with a different kind of energy, a quiet hum of resilience. It was in this shared silence, this unspoken acknowledgement of their respective scars, that a fragile connection, deeper than words, began to truly take root. The symbolism of brokenness and repair, so prevalent in his craft, resonated deeply with her own journey. He repaired metal, and in his quiet way, he was beginning to mend something within her too. Despite the growing connection, and the quiet solace found within the forge, the shadow of her perceived infertility loomed, a persistent specter, fed by the judgmental whispers of the community. News, even in their isolated valley, traveled swiftly, distorted by gossip and prejudice. One market day, as Ilara ventured into the village to collect supplies, she was met with cold stares and averted gazes. A group of women, their faces a tapestry of judgment, huddled together, their hushed tones carrying on the breeze. "Still can't believe Silas took her in," one murmured, loud enough for Ilara to hear. "A barren woman, a waste of a good hearth. What kind of future can a man build with that?" The words, so familiar yet still so sharp, pierced her, finding the old wounds and twisting them anew. Her hands clenched, the basket suddenly heavy. The old shame, the stinging sense of inadequacy, rushed over her, threatening to overwhelm the fragile sense of belonging she had begun to cultivate. The accusation, the very essence of her parents' rejection, echoed with renewed force. She was barren, a vessel without purpose, a dead end. When she returned to the forge, her face was pale, her shoulders slumped. Silas, sensing her distress, merely watched her, his gaze unwavering. He didn't ask, didn't pry, but his presence was a silent affirmation, a bulwark against the tide of societal cruelty. He simply placed a warm, heavy hammer into her hands, the weight grounding her, pulling her back from the precipice of despair. The familiar coldness of the steel, the steady rhythm of the work, slowly began to soothe the ragged edges of her pain. But the question lingered, a persistent open loop in her mind. Was her barrenness truly absolute, an unalterable truth, or was there something more, a hidden layer to this narrative of her existence that had yet to be revealed? The possibility, however faint, stirred a seed of suspense within her, a silent challenge to the judgment that had defined her. The persistent hum of the forge could not drown out the insidious whispers that, like persistent weeds, had begun to choke Ilara's fragile sense of peace. The societal judgment, amplified by Thorne's casual cruelty, festered within her, pushing her toward a precipice. The climax came on a particularly brutal winter's day, when a desperate, unbidden thought took root. Perhaps if she could prove her worth in some undeniable way, beyond the confines of the forge, the judgment might cease. She returned to her parents' dilapidated farm unannounced, the very air of the place still heavy with the echo of her banishment. Her mother, gaunt and stooped, greeted her with a flicker of something akin to fear, not welcome. "You've come back?" she rasped, her eyes darting nervously. Ilara stood tall, a stark contrast to the girl who had been cast out. "I need to know," she stated, her voice trembling with a contained fury. "Was it truly me? Or was there another reason for my sale?" Her father emerged, his face etched with familiar weariness, a deeper, almost panicked despair now visible. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, avoiding her gaze. The air thickened with unspoken secrets. Ilara pressed, her words sharp, brutal in their directness. "My infertility. Was it truly mine? Or was it a convenient truth for a desperate sale?" The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the icy whistle of the wind through the cracks in the house. Then, her mother, tears welling in her eyes, finally broke. "Your grandmother. She was barren, too. We thought it was a curse. We needed the money, Ilara. The crops failed. We had to choose." But the father cut in, his voice rough with a desperate truth. "No, that's not all of it. The land. It's cursed. My father was barren too. Not your mother, not your grandmother. It runs in the men of this line. We were desperate, Ilara. We said it was you, to make the transaction easier, to protect our name. The revelation hit Ilara like a physical blow, a stunning, brutal irony. All this time, the shame, the self-loathing, the years of silent suffering, built on a lie, a terrible misdirection. Her own parents had sacrificed her, not for a curse on her womb, but to shield their own line from perceived inadequacy, their own land from its relentless barrenness. The raw, unfiltered truth, so devastating in its implications, twisted the knife in her heart, but also, paradoxically, brought a strange, liberating clarity. She was not broken. They were. The revelation of her family's true lineage, the inherited barrenness of the men, not the women, struck Ilara with a profound, shattering force. It was a truth so bitter, so steeped in irony, that it left her reeling. The shame, the burden she had carried for so long, had never been hers to bear. Her parents, huddled figures in their dilapidated home, seemed to shrink before her eyes, their justifications hollow echoes in the cold air. There was no grand apology, no sweeping act of contrition, only the raw, exposed vulnerability of their desperation, their flawed choices. Ilara stared at them, the very people who had cast her out, now revealed as the true bearers of the curse they had so readily assigned to her. The anger, sharp and hot, was quickly tempered by a deep, weary sorrow. What was there to say? What could mend a wound so deeply inflicted, so carelessly dismissed? She turned from them, the silence a condemnation far more potent than any shouted accusation. The journey back to the forge was different. The wind still bit, but it no longer echoed her despair. Instead, it whispered a fierce, quiet vindication. She was not a barren field. She was a woman wronged, but whole. Silas awaited her, his face unreadable, but his eyes held a watchful, knowing quality. She did not have to speak. He saw the transformation, the subtle shift from brokenness to a hardened resolve. There was no triumph in her step, but a quiet strength, a resolve forged in the fire of truth. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the battle she had fought and won. The world outside the forge might still whisper, might still judge, but within its smoky confines, she had found her truth, and in that truth, a profound, unshakable foundation. The societal figures, the Mr. Thorns of the world, would continue their narrow-minded judgments, but their words would now fall on the deaf ears of a woman who finally knew her own worth, independent of their definitions. The raw pain of the past was still fresh, but it was no longer a consuming fire. It was a scar, a testament to her endurance, a reminder of the strength she had found in the depths of despair. Years later, the forge still hummed with the symphony of steel and fire, but its heart beat with a different rhythm. Ilara, no longer a discarded girl, but a woman of quiet strength and profound purpose, moved through the smoke and sparks with a practiced ease that rivaled Silas's own. Her hands, once soft, were now strong, etched with the stories of hammer and anvil, of resilience forged in hardship. The infertile label, once a brand of shame, had faded into a distant, hollow echo. It no longer defined her, for her worth was not measured by what she could bear biologically, but by what she could create, by the life she had built, by the solace she found in the purpose of her hands. She had learned to shape metal, to draw beauty from raw ore, to mend what was broken, skills that mirrored the healing within her own soul. Silas, his stoicism softened by the shared years, was no longer just a lonely blacksmith. He was a silent partner, a steadfast companion whose quiet presence was a constant, unwavering anchor. Their bond was forged not in fleeting passion, but in shared struggle, in the crucible of unlikely companionship. They had built something enduring, not a family in the traditional sense, but a life rooted in mutual respect and understanding, a testament to the fact that connection, purpose, and even love could bloom in the most barren of lands. The forge, once a place of exile, had become a sanctuary, a testament to the transformative power of acceptance and the quiet strength of two wounded souls finding solace in each other's presence. Ilara often found herself gazing at the intricate wooden bird Silas had mended, its once broken wing a symbol not of defect, but of repair, of beauty found in imperfection. Her parents remained distant, their lives confined by their choices, but Alara had found her own harvest, not of blood but of spirit, of resilience, of a quiet, enduring hope that shone brighter than any flame. Her story, once steeped in darkness, had found its own unique, powerful resolution, a testament to the enduring human spirit that seeks not only to survive, but to truly live, on its own terms.